it's a beautiful thing to actually be inspired by what you're looking forward to do, what you're trying to accomplish. And only through true inspiration, which if we break apart inspiration, it's actually in spirit, can we come up with the answers we're looking for when we're not really getting close to finding them. I'd like to start off with scripture that I just found probably half an hour ago, and it just popped in my head, and I decided it would be a great way in order to start this. And let's start reading in Exodus, the 7th chapter. In Exodus, the 7th chapter, beginning in verse 9, and we find here, this is when Moses was going to speak with Pharaoh about letting the Hebrew people go. And it says in Exodus chapter 7, verse 9, "When Pharaoh shall speak unto you, saying, Show a miracle for you, then thou shalt say unto Aaron, Take thy rod and cast it before Pharaoh, and it shall become a serpent." So God is telling Moses that when Pharaoh should speak this to him, that Moses should tell Aaron to take the rod and cast it on the ground before Pharaoh, and it will become a serpent. The 10th verse. "And Moses and Aaron went unto Pharaoh, and they did as the Lord hath commanded them. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh, and before his servants it became a serpent." So God told Moses to have Aaron throw the rod before Pharaoh, and it would become a serpent. And before Pharaoh and before all of his servants, the rod became a snake. The 11th verse. "Then Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers. Now the magicians of Egypt, they did also in like manner with their enchantments. For they cast down every man his rod, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods." Here's one time you actually see somebody doing something that it calls a sorcerer. You don't hear a lot about sorcerers through the New Testament. We find a few things in the Old Testament to talk about them, and that's one thing I'd like to take a look at today. First, let's take a look in Deuteronomy, the 18th chapter. In the book of Deuteronomy, the 18th chapter, beginning in the 9th verse, where it says, "When thou art come into the land which the Lord hath given thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations." So God is telling them when they are to come into the land that He has prepared for them, they're not to do after the people that are doing in that land. They're not to follow after those things. In the 10th verse, "There shall not be found among you any one that maketh his son or his daughter to pass through fire, or to use a divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consoler of familiar spirits, or of a wizard, or of a necromancer. For all that do these things are abomination unto the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee. Thou shalt be perfect with the Lord thy God." So God's telling them when they are going to come to this land that He's prepared for them, there are going to be people doing lots of things that are against God. There are going to be, as it says, charmers and enchanters and witches and all these things that are away from God, that God doesn't want His people to be. He wants His people to basically put these out and be perfect through the Lord thy God. Next, take a look at Leviticus. In the book of Leviticus, the 20th chapter, and the 26th verse, where it says, And ye shall be holy unto me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have served you from other people, that ye shall be mine. A man also, or a woman, that hath a familiar spirit, that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones. Their blood shall be upon them. So we find another part in here where God is telling them that people that have familiar spirits and are wizards should surely be put to death by stoning. And we can find a few times when people were actually stoned. You can read in the New Testament when Stephen was stoned. And right before he came to his death, he saw Christ. And at that point, he went to sleep and never woke up again. We know stoning is a very vicious way to die. You're basically throwing rocks at people in order to break their bones and to break their vessels and to cause them to bleed all over the place and basically go to a point when they lose enough blood that they die. And we've seen in the scripture so far where it says that's to be what is done to wizards, familiar spirits, charmers, witches, and things of that sort. And we've seen where in Exodus that Pharaoh had these charmers, these magic people before him to compete with the tricks that God had done to convince Pharaoh to release his people. I'm not going to begin to tell you why God doesn't like them. I'm not going to begin to tell you why God says they all need to be put to death. God's ways is higher and better than ours, and we simply have to follow after the things that we are told to do. And this is one thing that we are told to do throughout the Scriptures. Next, I'd like to take a look in Exodus, the 22nd chapter. In Exodus, the 22nd chapter, and beginning in verse 18, where it says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Whosoever liveth with the beast shall surely be put to death." So we find here continuation in this. Wizards, witches, any ones that do magic are to be put to death. And that's simply the way that God told his people that it needs to be done. And I can pretty much guarantee you that there were witches and there were wizards and there were people that do magic back then. They're around us today. Because the things that were around then, the power of God that was around then, is all still here today. The next reading, I'd like to take a look in 1 Samuel. In the book of 1 Samuel, beginning in the 28th chapter, read in the 3rd verse, where it says, "Now Samuel was dead, and all of Israel had lamented him, and buried him in Ramah, even in his own city. And Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits, and the wizards out of the land." So we find here an example of Saul following after the word that God had given to the people, following after the rules that God had given unto Moses. That Saul took the familiar spirits and took the wizards out of the land. Familiar spirits isn't quite an exact term. I mean, each one of us has a spirit. That's the portion of us that is made after the example of God. It's the only portion of us that will live forever. It's the portion that will be able to pass through the judgment and go to heaven and live with God forever, or not pass the judgment and go down to hell and be continually killed for eternity. When it talks about the second death, it never talks about the second death as simply something that happens and it's over. The second death is something that continues on through eternity, something a lot longer than we've ever lived. And that's the biggest reason why we should follow after the things which God has told us that we should do, in the Scriptures, because it's through those things that he will find whether we've been true to him or whether we don't deserve to live with that paradise that he has coming for us. Next, take a look in Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, the 8th chapter, and verse 18. The book of Isaiah, the 8th chapter, in verse 18, it says, "Behold, I and the children of whom the Lord hath given me are for signs and for wonders in Israel, for the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in the mountain Zion. And when they shall say unto you, Seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep, and that mutter, should not the people seek unto their God? For the living to the dead." So we find here where God is talking, and he's telling them that the people that are going to be told to seek after familiar spirits, to seek after wizards that peep and that mutter, and that's what the people that are around this area are going to tell them. We know that around the people at this time in the land that God had created for them, there were these people, and God's telling them they should not follow after these. And here's another point where God is telling them that they should not follow after these familiar spirits and wizards that peep. I'm not exactly sure what wizards that peep are, but it tells us through the Scriptures that we are not to follow after wizards. It says, should not these people seek after their God? Should not these people seek after the God that created them? The same God that created the wizards and created the witches and created the earth and created absolutely everything that is on it. We see simply that these people that the Scriptures speak about, these familiar spirits, these wizards and witches, are apparently those that have put away God and decided through their own power they will do these things. Whereas being a true child of God and following after God, we realize that we have no power. It's only through our understanding that we have no power, and we rely completely on God just to give us the strength to do these things, that we have to follow now. And we know that there are lots of people that have had these things that we are told to stay away from, that we are told to stone, that we are told to end. We find more things in the Old Testament that we're told to have people killed than we do in the New Testament. Whereas Christ told us, in your heart, if you truly desire to kill somebody, you don't even need to. You're guilty of it just as if you'd done it. And through these readings, I don't have anything out of the New Testament because we simply don't find a lot in the New Testament. It's something that was told in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, which has been given to us as a schoolmaster for examples on the way that God has treated his people. In the Old Testament, we can see the exact same story over and over again. The people follow God. The people turn their backs on God. They go their own ways. They believe they have their own strength. They believe they have their ability in order to do everything that they need to do. And what happened then? God caused famine, disease, any number of things. And what happened when God caused that? The people realized they were stupid. They realized they didn't have the ability for that. And they turned back to God for a time. And we see that story over and over and over again. And the one story I really wish to be a part of is when the people turn from God, there's always a righteous remnant. There's always a small group of the people that were doing the things that God had told them they should do, and were following after his ways. And we're told when the judgment comes, the great majority of people are not going to be found fitting to go and live in heaven. But there will be that righteous remnant. There will be that small group of people that God says that you've been found worthy and you should come and live in peace and happiness with our Father, who God has created us simply so we could be his people and he could be our God. Anyone that has the strength and power to create us, it's kind of stupid we turn our back on them. I mean, we're born of our parents, and we can turn our back on our parents, and we can get away from that. But God is everywhere you want him to be and everywhere you don't want him to be. God is around us every bit of the time. And we can hide the thoughts of our minds from people. We can trick people. We can tell people things that we really don't believe is true. We can lie and do all manner of things which are against God. But we can't keep any of that from God. For the final reading, I'd like to take a look in 2 Kings, the 23rd chapter. In 2 Kings, the 23rd chapter, 2 Kings, the 23rd chapter, we find the example for when they went into the land that God had told them to go. And it says, "But in the 18th year of King Josiah, wherein this Passover was holden to the Lord at Jerusalem, moreover the workers with familiar spirits and wizards, and the images and idols, and all the abominations were spied on in the land of Judah and Jerusalem. Did Josiah put away that he might perform the words of the law, which were written in the book that Hezekiah the priest found in his house of the Lord." So we find here when the children of Israel were coming, when God's chosen people were coming to live in Israel, in the area of Jerusalem and Judah, there were these familiar spirits. There were these wizards. And here with wizards, it actually puts the images and the idols, the things that are put before God. Just as when the children of Israel were brought before the mountain, and Moses went up to get the 10 Commandments. And what did they do? They had Aaron build them a golden calf so they could worship the calf, and they could worship something that they actually see right there. You know, people fall victim to the exact same things over and over again. It's in a different form, but it's still the same basic thing. It's still, they don't have the imagination as children do. Children have an amazing imagination. They can come up with stories and follow lines and everything all within their mind. But as we grow up, we tend to get more short-sighted. We tend to lose that imagination. And if we lose that imagination to where there is something that's controlling us that we cannot see, we cannot feel, but it's always around us, it's always affecting us. When you don't have the imagination in order to have something like that, then that's when you fall prey to things like images and idols. And to say, this is my God, this is what created me, when you're really what created it. I mean, it's like if we turned it around where people would rule over God. People could never rule over God. Because people cannot even interact with God the way they believe to, because God's got all the power. God's got the ability to do whatever God wants. And we simply have to realize we have no power. We have to follow after the things which He has told us. And in these 8 scriptures that we've read, we've seen where there are wizards, there are witches, there are familiar spirits, there are, as we see in this last verses, idols and images and all the things which are abomination unto God. As God told us, we should just live with them in peace, and we should follow after the things, and we should work with them, and we should all be happy. That's not what God told us. God told us that the people that do these things are abomination to Him. And they should be stoned. They should be put to death. Because that's the way He would have it to be. And however God says it needs to be, it's not our place in order to say He's wrong. It's not our place in order to say it doesn't happen. It's our place simply to follow and understand He has a reason for everything God tells us to do. If you knew what His reasons were, then you could possibly try to come out and argue with it, but we have no understanding, the complete understanding of what His reasons are, the way He has told us to do things. All we know is He's given us many things that we should do, and He is the one that is going to decide whether we live a fruitful and a life fearing